All right. Good afternoon, everybody. We're seeing some more folks filter in over the next couple of minutes here. So we'll give folks just a little bit until we see the participants number start to level out a little bit. And we will go over it in a little bit, but at the moment, the chat is disabled. The Q&A session, or the Q&A, is where you can ask questions or ask for clarifications on anything. And we will go ahead and answer those as much as we can as they come in. Okay, so we are about 3 minutes in. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. I am starting to see the number of participants kind of level out. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tyler Galley, and I am a Senior Housing Policy Specialist with HCD's ADU team. Here with me is my coworker, David Barbosa, who is also a Senior Housing Policy Specialist on the ADU team. As I am sure many of you are aware, the last ADU Handbook release took place in the middle of 2022, and there's been some pretty significant changes to state ADU law since then. In putting together the new handbook, we sought to cover as many of those major changes as we could. And so a few of the topics we're going to go over today. First, David is going to talk a bit about the basics, going to go over some definitions and stats, benefits that we've seen come from ADU development, as well as the bureaucratic side of things. He'll talk about HCD's role in the Housing Accountability Unit, or the HAU, which the ADU team belongs to, and the different types of engagement that the department has with the general public and other public entities. Next slide, please. Then it will be back to me, and we'll go over the past few years of legislative changes that impact ADUs, and there's a lot to cover there. Once I've gone through a summary of each of those bills and their impacts, David will finally talk about what you all came here to hear, which is the big changes to the ADU handbook in 2025. We will have a Q&A going throughout the presentation and stop between segments to cover a few questions, as well as a longer Q&A towards the end with whatever time is left over. Please feel free to ask questions at any time using the Q&A function on Zoom, and be specific when doing so. We may be moving faster than we can answer these questions, so saying things like this or that when referring to slides or any of this content can get kind of lost in the weeds. We will answer some questions throughout the course and then whatever we have time for at the end as well. However, you'll see the ADU Technical Assistance Portal here. There may also be questions where we either need to take it offline to give a more complete answer later on, or that we're not able to get to here. And for those and any other questions that you may have later, please go to the ADU team's technical assistance portal. You can find it on HCD's ADU webpage and by clicking on this yellow box here at the bottom of the slide. I also want to bring up, whenever we cite a code section and we don't state which code, we are talking about the California Government Code. That's where our jurisdiction lies, and that's what we're referencing basically every time. Next slide, please. So with all of the housekeeping out of the way, I will go ahead and pass this show on to David.
All right, thanks very much, Tyler. All right, so next slide, please. So first off, I'd like to go over some key concepts in state ADU law. Most important of which is, what is an accessory dwelling unit, or ADU? So an ADU, the key characteristics are it's on a property with a primary residence, and that can be either a single family or a multifamily primary residence. And it can be existing or proposed on the primary. It's going to have permanent spaces for living, sleeping, eating, cooking, and sanitation. And there are different variations, like an ADU that's attached to the primary dwelling, detached, and conversion. Next, please. And then a junior ADU or JADU is a special type that's formed entirely by converting space in a single family residence. And that can include a garage that's attached to a single family residence. JADUs are limited to 500 square feet, and they can share a bathroom with the main house or have their own bathroom. If they have, I'm sorry, could we go back, please? Thank you. So if they share a bathroom with the main house, then there has to be an internal connection between the JADU and the main house. And so on the site plan here, you can see an example where there's a house and an attached garage and a proposed JADU at the rear of the house. Now, if this garage were attached, like I mentioned, it could be, the JADU could be converted from that attached garage. Next, please. All right, so a couple of terms in state ADU law that it might be a little bit confusing because they sound very similar are these two, livable space and living area. So they are slightly different though. So livable space is the space in a dwelling intended for human habitation, including living, sleeping, eating, cooking, or sanitation, whereas living area is space within the dwelling unit. So not the building as a whole, but the unit, including basements and attics, and that does not include a garage or an accessory structure. So like livable space is referenced in the context of multifamily conversion ADUs, because you can convert spaces that are not used as livable space to ADUs. And the living area is referenced in the context of setback requirements and the internal connection that I was just talking about for a JADU. Next, please. All right, another two terms that are easy to confuse are local agency and permitting agency. So a local agency is basically a city or county, or a city and county if you're like in San Francisco. And it also, ADU law also applies fully to charter cities and counties. And a permitting agency is an entity that's involved in the review of an ADU permit, ADU or JDU permit application, but there's no substitute. So for example, like a planning department or a building department or a utility. So typically like a local agency is going to contain at least planning and building, and then it may also contain like permitting agencies and utilities if the utilities are municipal, or the utility might be external to the local agency. Next, please. All right, so and then some other terms that we're going to be using in the presentation include non-conforming zoning condition. So this occurs when a structure is built according to a particular set of standards, and then like the zoning standards change, and so what's built there now no longer conforms to the current zoning standards. And then objective standards are a really important concept in ADU law because ADU reviews are, with a few narrow exceptions, like ADUs in the coastal zone, ADU reviews are ministerial, which means they're only based on objective standards. Those standards that involve no personal or subjective judgment by a public official. So the concept here is like with an objective standard, it's not really ambiguous what it means, right? Like if I say, an ADU shall be 4 feet from side property line, that's an objective standard. If I say the exterior elevations of the ADU shall be compatible with surrounding structures, that's subjective. That's not an objective standard, right? Next, please. All right, 66323 units. So also a very important concept. So these are ADUs that are approved under Government Code Section 66323. And in the previous version of our handbook, which was published in 2022, these were referred to as statewide exemption ADUs. So with 66323 units, this is a special category of ADUs that are subject to limited standards. Like there's one category of ADUs that are subject to the full range of local standards that are consistent with state ADU law. And then there's this other category of 66323 units that are only subject to the standards in 66323, which includes the California Building Standards Code and any local amendments to that code. Yeah, and so some examples of development standards that apply to detached ADUs under 66323 are side and rear setbacks and height limits. Next, please. All right, and so just to give an overview of where we've been over the past several years with ADUs in California, the legislature really has been making an effort since laws that took effect in 2017 to make it easier to build ADUs. Like there's been some version of this on the book since the 1980s, but it's only really been since 2017 that it's taken off quite a bit. And as you can see here, now we're up to about 29,000 ADUs being permitted every year across the state, and that's about 21% of the new housing units that were permitted across California in 2023. Next, please. All right, so why are ADUs important? Well, they really have a lot of benefits. On the affordability side, ADUs are often built on properties that somebody has already purchased. So imagine like a homeowner who like to put a new unit in the back. So the land's already been purchased. That makes it more affordable to build the ADU. And then ADUs also tend to be smaller than conventional dwelling units and use wood frame construction, which makes them more affordable to build. Another benefit of ADUs is the income that they generate. So, they can generate income for homeowners as rental income. And then obviously it's work for contractors and permit fees and tax revenue for local governments. ADUs are great as a way to provide support for extended family and seniors. We have a lot of, we have an aging population due to the demographics and like the baby boom generation. And so oftentimes we find seniors who've been in their homes for a long time, but those homes were built, before there was any real consideration of accessibility needs. And so an ADU can be a great way to build a new home that's custom, tailored to meet the accessibility needs of the resident. They're also great for adult children. You have kids coming out of high school and college who are trying to get a foothold in the job market, but might need a little support dealing with the high cost of rent in California. And they're also great for single person and small households. So many, we have a lot more households that aren't like the traditional nuclear family, but a lot of our housing stock isn't really tailored to that. So ADUs are a great way to provide flexibility for different kinds of households. And there's more. Next, please. So in terms of housing supply, this is another important aspect of affordability. So it's like, ADUs are a way to build more housing in existing neighborhoods um, without making it really obvious that the physical form of the neighborhood is a little bit different. And that helps with acceptance of ADUs as a concept politically. So ADUs are really great at providing, addressing the shortage of market rate housing, but there's also a deed restricted affordable option in state ADU law where a qualified nonprofit corporation can develop an ADU for a qualified buyer. And then local agencies also have the option to allow ADUs to be sold separately as condos. And that can be a great option for a first-time home buyer. And then in terms of like environmental sustainability, infill development is really important. There's a lot of state policy geared towards infill development because it saves natural habitat, it saves working lands like farmland, and it reduces driving because you're putting people closer to jobs and services. And even if people are still driving for a lot of their trips, the distances they have to travel are shorter. So even if there's not like a mode switch, there's a reduction in driving. And ADUs are also great because they're going to comply with current energy codes. So our energy efficiency requirements, some ADUs are required to have solar panels on them. And they're also modestly sized. This is an aspect of sustainability that often gets overlooked, but it's like when you're thinking about energy use in the home, especially HVAC, having smaller homes means you save energy, right? And then on equity, it's really important here because ADUs are opening up housing opportunities that are relatively affordable in a lot of neighborhoods that have traditionally excluded those kinds of opportunities, right? So they're opening up single-family neighborhoods for different kinds of people to live in, and that's great. ADUs also promote home equity and wealth building. Next, please. All right. So this might be a good time to take a quick pause and see if there are any questions that we can answer. Tyler, do you have any questions that we should take a look at the moment?
There are quite a few. I'm still going through some of them, and I've been answering some. With regard to kind of what you have gone over here, let's see. Let's see. Are you seeing any that pertain to what you're going over? Because we do have quite a few questions in here, but not all of them.
Yeah, I was starting to answer some at the top. Let me see if they, let's see.
Because some of these may be better suited for the end as well.
Okay, so I think I have the next section, so maybe we can just continue for a while and then
Sure.
get back to some questions. Sounds good. All right, so yeah, so talking here about HCD's role with ADUs. So Tyler and I are part of a team that provides technical assistance on ADU law, and so we're within a division of HCD, the California Department of Housing and Community Development, that focuses on housing policy. So like there are other parts of HCD that focus on administering state and federal funds. Our division is focused on housing policy. And within that, there's a team called Land Use and Local Government Relations, which houses the Housing Accountability Unit. So HCD has an oversight role and an enforcement role with regard to several state housing laws, not just ADU law, but thinking about things like housing element law, density bonus law, Housing Accountability Act, Housing Crisis Act. So we're on a team that has a pretty broad scope across state housing law. Next, please. All right, so what does our team do, the ADU team? Well, we provide technical assistance. First and foremost, we have a website that gives an overview of state ADU law, links to resources like the handbook, and it lets you know how you can submit questions to us directly. So we get a lot of questions from developers. With ADUs, a lot of developers are not like professional developers, they're homeowners. And so sometimes, they may not be as familiar with development procedures because they're doing it for the first time. And that's fine. Like ADU's law is designed to be kind of streamlined. And that's one of the reasons. But also, architects and building designers, development companies, and local government representatives. And then we often get asked about development standards, review processes, local policies and practices, and impact fees. Next, please. All right, so another thing that our team does is we review ADU ordinances. So ADU law requires local agencies to submit ordinances to HGB within 60 days after adoption. And then our management team assigns them for review. So, we'll go through, read the ordinance carefully, and then we'll list out any issues that we find, and, indicate how any problems should be corrected. And then we'll send that to the local agency as a letter. And then when the local agency gets that, they have a couple of options. They can adopt a new ordinance that addresses all of our points, or they can address some of our points, maybe some and not others. Sometimes there are disagreements about what the law means. So sometimes a local agency will readopt all or a portion of their ordinance and make findings as to why they think they're correct on their interpretation of the law. We also do reviews for ADU ordinances in the coastal zone. So when the local government is doing that, they'll draft an ordinance, and they'll submit the draft to us. And because we're trying to get our feedback in early in that process before the Coastal Commission starts its review. So that's another service that we provide. And then we always like to lead with technical assistance, but occasionally that doesn't resolve the situation. And so we have other enforcement options that we can turn to, including a notice of violation and referral to the Office of the Attorney General. Next, please. All right, and with that, we may want to take a pause here and circle back to some questions. Well, this is great. We're getting so many questions. We probably won't be able to get to all of them, but I'll try to see here. So one question I see here from Jasmine Hancock, has HDB made any kind of findings regarding septic systems in the state? We're being told by the State Water Board and other counties that ADUs will not be permissible on any lot smaller than 0.5 acre. We're hoping this can be addressed. So there are a couple of provisions in state ADU law that address septic systems. So under Government Code Section 66314, there's a requirement for approval by the local health officer. And then under Section 66323, it talks about requirements for a percolation test. So ADU law in this area does defer to local health and safety standards, as long as they're properly adopted. Okay, and then let's see. The next question I see here from Ziva Altman: how are tiny homes taxed, by the DMV or property tax? So, earlier we talked about the definition of an ADU. An ADU is defined in a way where it's not a vehicle. So sometimes people use the term tiny home to refer to a vehicle. But there are options to build ADUs that are small, like, for example, an ADU can be an efficiency unit. It can be as small as 150 square feet. And so if we're talking about something that would meet the definition of an ADU, it would be like an improvement to real property, not a vehicle. So it'd be like more in the property tax category. And maybe I'll take one more here from Paul Boyd. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing anyone's name, by the way. Paul Bollier asked, at your convenience, is it our understanding a parcel with a single-family house is the primary driver for the property, allowing for one ADU, even if a multifamily unit shares the same parcel, meaning the garages for the multifamily unit cannot build ADU garage conversion. So in a situation where there's both a single family and a multifamily primary residence on the property, we'll look at that as a multifamily property for purposes of the kinds of ADUs you can build under 66223. And I think we'll be getting into those combination issues a little bit later in the presentation. All right, so having answered a few questions here, I think I'll pass it over to Tyler to talk about recent ADU legislation.
All right, and there are quite a few questions in here that will be answered in the recent legislation portion. So for a lot of these questions that I'm seeing coming up, we will be getting to a lot of these portions very shortly here. So thank you for that, David. Now, as I had mentioned before I handed that off to David, there have been a lot of new laws affecting ADUs since our last handbook in 2022. So I did want to go over each one and give a brief summary of what each of them does. I'm also going to apologize in advance as this section is pretty information dense, and if I'm moving too fast or need to repeat or rephrase something, please go ahead and let me know. And so on this slide here, we can see in 2022, we saw SB 9. And it's worth mentioning because while it doesn't deal directly with ADUs, there has been a lot of interplay between this and ADU law. SB 9 provided for ministerial approval of developments which are 2 units or less, and provides a simplified path for urban lot splits, adds 2 sections of the government code to that effect, which are 65852.21 and 66411.7 there on the slide. These 2 sections work together to facilitate up to 4 units, including ADUs and JADUs, even on lots zoned for single-family residential. So everything that we'll talk about from here on out was enacted following SB 9 and deals directly with ADU law. So SB 897 and AB 2221 may be some of the most significant changes to ADU law since we saw AB 881 and AB 68 in 2019. Starting with SB 897, this defined objective standards, as you heard from David just a few minutes ago, and changes the way that occupancy types in residential units apply to ADUs. That's tied to fire sprinkler requirements too, stating that an ADU cannot trigger fire sprinkler requirements within the primary dwelling, thus requiring them in the ADU as well. This bill also requires that denials must include a correction list. And for those of you here who are unfamiliar with the permitting process, a denial is when a permitting agency finds something in the plan review process which is not compliant, whether that's in the construction materials, the siting, the methods, etc. So what SB 897 does is require those permitting agencies to provide a complete list of all of these findings, as well as how to remedy them. And that needs to be done on the same timeline as the review. It cannot come later. It also added the statutory inclusion of JADUs within attached garages, which is an important distinction to make as it allows attached enclosed accessory structures to become all or part of a JADU. David showed a graphic of something similar to that a little bit ago. And finally, SB 897 establishes Government Code 66332, which used to be 65852.23, addressing ADU amnesty, and we'll go into why that changed a little bit later. Now, to be clear, the word amnesty isn't used anywhere within state law or state ADU law. What section 66332 does is prohibit a local agency, a city or county, from denying a permit for an unpermitted ADU, and now JADU, thanks to another bill. So it prevents them from denying a permit for that unpermitted ADU that was constructed prior to a certain date. That date used to be January 1st of 2018. It is now January 1st of 2020. Again, we'll go over when that also changed. But this does not apply to unpermitted dwellings that are deemed substandard by Health and Safety Code 17920.3. And I will go ahead and say that again, because I think that might be the first code section that isn't the government code. It is Health and Safety Code 17920.3. Looking at AB 2221, this bill specifically included detached garages within ADU law's location provisions, clarifying that ADUs can be constructed within those detached accessory spaces. It also goes on to define permitting agency, as David also went over a little bit ago. And it changes the wording in section 66317 from act on to approve or deny with regard to ADU application review. So instead of a local agency needing to act on an application within 60 days, it clarified that a local agency needed to approve or deny it in that time. And I'm sorry, permitting agency needed to approve or deny in that time. Finally, one of the biggest changes that AB 2221 does is it created an exception within ADU law to allow for a previously allowed 800 square foot ADU to be created within front setbacks if those setbacks would have otherwise prevented it from existing. That was a question I did see a couple times in our Q&A here. So to clarify on that, that 800 square foot allowance is allowed in front setbacks if those setbacks would have otherwise prevented it from existing. So a local agency can have objective standards for an attached ADU that goes into the front setbacks, but a detached is still protected under Government Code 66323, I believe subdivision A2, which is the 800 square foot detached dwelling unit. Some big shakeups happened this year as well. If we could go to the next slide. So the bills from this past year in 2024 were big for us, but primarily administrative changes and restrictions that are placed on ADUs once they're built, rather than simplifying the application process. AB 976 and AB 1033 came into effect on January 1st of 2024. AB 976 changed the way that local agencies may require rentals on ADUs created under section 66314, stating that they may require them to be rented for a period of 30 days or more. This differs from units created under section 66323, which must be rented for a period of greater than 30 days. So that's the difference between those two rental period requirements. It also removed the owner occupancy requirement present within ADU law entirely, although those requirements do still apply to JADUs. AB 1033 added section 66342 to ADU law, which details a rather long and specific method by which local agencies can allow for the separate sale of ADUs, but not for JADUs. This section has only been taken advantage of by a small handful of local agencies, so if there are any curious agency reps out there listening, this is your chance to become an early adopter. I can count on one hand, I think, the number of agencies actually taking advantage of this. If we could go to the next slide, please. So also in effect in 2024, AB 434 is a big one for us on the ADU team because it granted HCD enforcement authority over several statutes within the government code. That includes ADUs, JADUs, and ministerial approval of projects such as ADUs or SB9 projects. And it also granted enforcement authority over how local agencies address a path to compliance for unpermitted dwellings. So there's that ADU amnesty again. Finally, SB 477 was passed and enacted on March 25th of last year. And SB 477 completely repealed the old ADU law effective at the time in Government Code 65852.2, 0.22, and 0.23. And then it created a new chapter divided into 4 articles from Government Code section 66310 to 66342. And so those sections are going to be Article 1 is kind of the administrative and definitions. Article 2 is ADU law. Article 3 is JADU law, and Article 4 is that separate conveyance and sale of ADUs. This was primarily due to ADU law getting so long and changing so often that for the sake of clarity and readability, it was easier to break it up. So all that to say, don't go looking for section 65852.2 anymore because it's not there. If we could move on to the next slide. Moving into this year, 2025. So we had some pretty exciting changes here as well. From programs that local agencies are required to implement, opening up what applicants are allowed to build and where, and lots of changes to that amnesty that we continue to talk about. AB 1332 was a law that actually passed back in 2023, but it didn't take effect until January 1st of this year. So it gave local agencies some time to prepare to implement this program. The program implemented, or the program that this mandates, is in 65852.27, and it requires a local agency to accept plans for pre-approval. Essentially, an applicant can submit ADU plans as a template of sorts, and once approved, that template can be applied to any lot that it can fit on, as long as the setbacks and any development standards that apply would allow. So kind of like a cookie cutter. These cookie cutter plans may be submitted by anyone and are not specifically restricted. Once they've been approved, these plans can also be used by anyone, and they have an expedited review period of 30 days rather than the standard 60-day review that is found within Government Code section 66317. SB 1211 is another one that there were quite a few questions on in the chat. So SB 1211 is one that makes a few miscellaneous changes. Some are more significant than others, but I'll go over them in the order that they appear in ADU law. The first is yet another definition that you heard from David, livable space. So remember that is different from living area, and that one is used in section 66323 specifically. Next is a small edit in section 66314. It clarifies that uncovered off-street parking, in addition to covered spaces that are lost when an ADU is constructed, do not need to be replaced. And the next two changes from SB 1211 are in section 66323. The first amends subdivision A4, which has to do with multifamily ADUs. This is one part that I saw a lot of questions about specifically. It allows for either up to 8 ADUs or the number of ADUs equal to the existing units on the lot, whichever is lower. So for a lot with an existing multifamily dwelling, if there are 4 dwellings on the lot, you can do up to 4 ADUs. If there are 16 dwellings on the lot, you can do up to 8. So 8 is the maximum, but you can get as many as are there otherwise. For proposed multifamily dwellings, you can have 2 detached ADUs on a lot. And the second change to 66323 is the new subdivision B. This clarifies that no additional design or development standard other than those which are in section 66323 may be applied to units created under section 66323. So that means that any local development or design standards cannot be applied to units created under 66323 subdivision A 1 through 4. Next slide, please. So I know that that was a lot, and the last bill that we're going to go over in 2025 before we're done with this year is AB 2533. This bill changes up the ADU amnesty we talked about from SB 897, and that is section 66332. It adds a provision that moves the date from amnesty up to January 1st of 2018 to January 1st of 2020. And then it goes on to prohibit a local agency from applying any work without permit fees, unpermitted structure fees, basically any punitive measures for having the ADU to begin with, as long as it was created prior to that date. And this is to hopefully incentivize getting those units permitted. Similarly, it prohibits impact fees and connection fees, but amnesty, fee waivers, all of the things that we're talking about with this still do not apply if the unit itself does not comply with Health and Safety Code 17920.3. And that also means for any infrastructure that is required for the unit to comply with Health and Safety Code 17920.3. And what that code section is the substandard dwellings part of the Health and Safety Code. So essentially it's saying that these units still cannot be substandard. However, the last thing that AB 2533 does is require local agencies to inform the public about these conditions. So it requires local agencies to provide information on what a substandard building is and what makes a building substandard. And next slide, please. So we have one more, and this is what is coming up next year in 2026. SB 1077 was signed into law this year. However, the deadline for it is mid-2026. And this bill requires our organization, HCD, to coordinate with the California Coastal Commission to draft up guidance to local governments in amending their local coastal plans, or LCPs, in order to streamline ADU processing. And the reason I'm bringing this one up is that this bill requires that there will be at least one workshop that's open to the public and open to public comment between now and then. So keep your eyes and ears open. That is all that I've got, and I'm sure that everybody got that the first time around, right? So I do think that, David, if we've got some questions, we will take a moment to pause here and go over some of those. Anything that relates to what I had gone over here?
Thanks so much, Tyler. Yeah, we have lots and lots of amazing questions I've been
I'm sure.
talking. And let's see. I have some, they may not super directly relate to the section you were just doing, but maybe we can take a crack at it. Lisa Kranitz asks, if someone wants to build a unit under 66223 ministerial in the front yard setback, but it would fit in the backyard, can you make them build in the backyard?
So if someone wants to build a unit under 323 in the front yard setback, but it will fit in the backyard. So under 323, 66323, no. So units that are protected under Government Code 66323 cannot have those local design and development standards applied to them. Those are specifically exempt from those requirements.
All right, thank you. And Alexis Oropesa asks, in a multifamily dwelling, are amenity spaces like gyms, recreation rooms considered livable?
So those would be considered non-livable space. So any of those enclosed spaces, rec rooms, etc., those would be considered non-livable space. So those could be converted into ADUs under Government Code 66323 subdivision A3, assuming that they are connected to the dwelling units.
Thank you. And the next question is there any size limit that can be placed on a detached ADU in a multifamily zone?
So if the unit is being constructed under Government Code Section 66323 and it complies with all of those requirements, then there is no size limit that is spelled out within Section 66323 for those. However, if it is not, and it's being constructed just standard through any other ADU process, essentially Government Code 66314 through 322, then there can be size and location restrictions on those.
All right, thank you. We've got lots of additional questions, but maybe we should take on the next section. We'll tackle more questions as we go.
And I'll be answering them as well as you're taking over here.
Thanks so much. All right, so yeah, so I wanted to give an overview here of some changes to the handbook. Apart from or kind of like in addition to the legislation that Tyler just talked about. So one thing here is application completeness. So we've provided some new guidance here to clarify when an application is complete, because there's a part of ADU law, Government Code 66317, subdivision A, that says when you have an existing primary dwelling, the local agency has 60 days to approve or deny an ADU application from the date that they receive a complete application. So what's a complete application, right? So this is a question that's addressed by the Permit Streamlining Act in Government Code Section 65943. There's a special definition of project that applies to that section that would include things like ADUs. So basically the local agency, when they receive an ADU application, there's supposed to be a checklist of what the submittal requirements are. When they receive an application, they're reviewing it first against that checklist just to make sure all the basic components of the application are there. And so they have 30 days to determine whether the application is complete. And if they don't do that within 30 days, then it's deemed complete by law. And then the 60 days runs from the date of receipt of a complete application. So this is just helpful. Sometimes there are misunderstandings about, what's required in terms of timelines. Next slide, please. All right, so fire hazard severity zones, definitely a salient topic, especially with the recent fires in Southern California, which are very top of mind for everyone at HCD. So one thing to keep in mind here is that when you're in a fire hazard severity zone, these are areas that are designated by the state fire marshal for state responsibility areas, and then there are local responsibility areas where the state fire marshal recommends zones that local agencies adopt, and then like local agencies have some leeway within that to add additional areas or upgrade the severity ratings of those areas. So when you're in a fire hazard severity zone, that's going to trigger additional building standards. The building standards code, there are provisions of the residential code, the building code, and the fire code that address this. So basically, the concept is buildings have to be built to a higher standard of fire safety in a fire hazard severity zone. So state ADU law has a provision in Government Code 66314, subdivision A, that allows local agencies to designate areas where ADUs are allowed or not allowed. And that can be based on 4 criteria. And so it's the availability of water, sewer, traffic flow, and public safety. So public safety would be the relevant one here. And so the fact that a structure is in a fire hazard severity zone does not in and of itself justify excluding ADUs, because they have to be held to higher building standards in those areas. But there may be situations, the law is intended to provide some flexibility for situations where it may be logical to exclude ADUs in a limited area. So when a local agency does that, they have to make detailed findings of fact explaining their reasoning for doing so. Next slide, please. Okay, so on multifamily conversions, so one of the things that's clarified here is, so Tyler was talking about recent legislation. One of the things that's new in recent ADU legislation is this definition of livable space that's used in the context of multifamily conversions. And so with that added clarity in the law, we were able to go into the handbook and clarify that a leasing office that supports a multifamily dwelling structure would not be considered a livable space. So that would be an example of an area that's eligible for multifamily conversion. And the 25% rule, again, that's where the number of multifamily conversion ADUs you can do is equal to the number of multifamily dwelling units times 25%, or 1, whichever is greater. So like if you have 3 multifamily units, you can still do 1 ADU, right? If you have 8, you can do 2 ADUs. If you have 12, you can do 3, right? But yeah, this thing about the leasing office is new to the current handbook. Next, please. Another clarification in the handbook is regarding townhomes. So we clarified that townhomes are considered a single-family dwelling when they're on their own lot. So if you think about, a city that has a lot of townhomes, often they're on these. If you think about it, let's say outside of the condo context for a sec, think about like a lot that's kind of narrow, that has a townhome in the front, maybe it has a garage in the back. There's just one unit on that lot, even though a townhome by definition is sharing side walls, right? So when we're in that situation, the townhome is eligible for the single family ADUs under 66323. So a single family conversion, a JDU, and a single family detached up to 800 square feet. Next, please. All right, so another thing so this table is new to the handbook, and this is regarding 66323 combination. However, the interpretation of the law, like the reading of the law that this is based on, is not new to the handbook. This is something we get asked about a lot. So what exactly can you build on a property? What are the combinations of ADUs that are allowed, right? So in the table, you see the middle column with the heading single family primary dwelling. And then you see the 3 cells below that that are highlighted in white. So that's explaining that those types of ADUs can be combined on a lot with a single family primary dwelling. So that's the a single family conversion ADU, a JDU, and a detached ADU up to 800 square feet. So it's very important to highlight that like all of those can be combined on one lot. Okay, and then in the rightmost column for multifamily primary dwellings, you have the 2 cells highlighted in white towards the bottom, and that's referring to multifamily conversion and multifamily detached. So on the left slide, I was just talking about the rule for conversion, right? There's a formula for how many conversion ADUs you can build, the 25% rule. And then for the multifamily detached, this is new, SB 1211. So how many multifamily detached ADUs you can do depends on whether the multifamily dwelling is existing or proposed. So if it's proposed, you can do up to 2. If it's existing, you can do up to 8, but not more than the number of existing dwelling units on the property. So for example, if you had, give an example, like let's say you have an existing 12-unit apartment building, and you have non-livable spaces that you'd like to convert to ADUs, so like say like attached garages, right? So you could do 25% of the 12 units, right? So you could do 3 conversion ADUs, and then you could do up to 8 detached ADUs, right? So it's the conversion and detached for multifamily, just like with single family, can be combined on a single property. Right? So that's a significant, and the up to 8 thing is a significant change in it. Okay, next please. All right, so the handbook also it goes into more detail about funding. So the California Housing Finance Agency runs an ADU grant program. Typically, it gets funding periodically, and then the funds go very quickly because it's a great program that helps people handle pre-development costs like permits and fees and the development of plans. Up to $40,000 for income qualified households. When I last checked this a couple days ago, their website said they were still out of money, but they have a mailing list that you can sign up for if you're interested. And then there's another category of programs here, like CalHome and the permanent local housing allocation. So these are grants where like one of the, or funding programs where one of the purposes that the funds can be put to is assisting local governments in promoting ADUs. So say they're trying to update their ADU regulations or come up with pre-approved plans or just do something to facilitate ADUs. These grants could be helpful there. And then on the federal loan side, so here we're just clarifying FHA, Freddie Mac, and Fannie Mae are entities that they're either like insuring mortgages or they're buying mortgages and selling mortgage-backed securities. So they have influence over mortgage lenders because they provide these services that lenders find useful. And so they have guidelines that are now pushing more in the direction of like, if you're having trouble qualifying for a loan, you may be able to count potential future rental income from an ADU as part of your income. So, if you're trying to get a loan for an ADU and you're running into problems, you may want to keep that in mind. Ask your lender about that. And then just to clarify, the ADU team that we're a part of doesn't administer any funding programs. So we're just kind of pointing you in the direction of some resources. Next, please. All right, and so there's also expanded coverage about homeowners associations and DCNR's governance conditions and restrictions. So we have these two civil code sections. 714.3 is the more comprehensive one. And this specifically addresses CC&Rs that effectively prohibit or unreasonably restrict ADUs or JADUs. So in the handbook, then we give some examples of what that might look like. So delays beyond the deadlines in state ADU law, requirements that substantially increase costs, conditioning HOA approval on neighbor approval. These are all no-nos that would be, um, frowned upon under these civil code sections with regard to ADUs. And then the pro housing designation program is another kind of like a new topic in the handbook. So this will reward local governments for going above and beyond on housing policy. So if you get the pro housing designation, you're eligible for the specific pro housing incentive program funding stream. And then there are other state funding programs like affordable housing and sustainable communities, or the infill infrastructure grant, where you can get extra points. So like you have a stronger application with the pro housing designation than without it. And so the way that ADUs tie into that is, in order to be eligible for the designation, you have to be in compliance with state housing law. And then if you have policies that go above and beyond, that can help you out, get you additional points towards the pro housing designation. Yeah, and so now we've reached the end of our slideshow, and we have about half an hour for additional questions. I'd be happy to pick that.
Let me run one question here. I did have a couple here that I wanted to answer live. If I can find them now. But if there's any that you're seeing that relate to kind of the scope of what we've been discussing here.
Okay. Yeah. So I can maybe kick it off with taking a few questions. So Jared Jerome asked, local agencies shall allow at least one ADU within an existing multifamily dwelling and up to 25% of the existing multifamily dwelling units. If, say, there's an MFR that is 12 units, is the jurisdiction required to allow one or three? So if there, in that case, we're talking about multifamily conversions. And so so it would be the 25% rule. So it would be 3 conversion ADUs are allowed. And if they also want to do detached ADUs, that would be an option as well. Let's see. Alicio Velasco asked, what's the difference between standard ADUs and 66323 ADUs? Yeah, that's a good question with a kind of a complex answer, but basically 66323 units are subject to a more limited set of standards. So it's like in 66323, you're really limited to just the California Building Standards Code and what's in 66223. So remember the types of 66223 units are single family conversion, JADU, single family detached up to 800 square feet, multifamily conversion, multifamily detached. So one big difference is that if you're doing an attached new construction ADU, that's not a 66323 unit. But there's a slight asterisk to that for if you do a 150 square foot addition to a single family conversion, but that's kind of like a footnote. But the other thing is so the other bucket of ADUs, like Government Code Section 66314, allows local agencies to have a wider range of objective development standards. And you also have larger allowances for the square footage of certain ADUs under 66314. So 663 has more limited development standards, but it's also a little bit more limited in the types of ADUs that you can do. Right. And then
I've got a couple here.
Oh, you got one? Okay.
Yeah, a couple of them. So One is can a manufactured home placed in the backyard of a single family dwelling be considered an ADU? And the answer to that is yes. In fact, the definition of accessory dwelling unit in Government Code 66313 specifies that manufactured homes can be ADUs. And then another one that I think is a good clarification to make here is, can an ADU have a 3-car garage attached? The answer to that is yes, but only the ADU portion, so the livable space that is an ADU, is protected by ADU law. So those 4-foot setbacks, for instance, anything like that. Only that portion is protected by ADU law. The 3-car garage can have all of those local development standards applied to it, same as if it were any other accessory structure.
Let's see, I see another question here. So Cody Smith asks, do ADUs have to comply with local jurisdiction architectural requirements? So ADUs under Government Code Section 66314 do have to comply with objective development standards, which can include things like, it kind of depends on what you mean by architectural requirements, but if you're referring to things like that you might call design standards, like the types of wall cladding materials or things like that, like the building materials that you see on the exterior elevations. Yes, ADUs do have to comply with those under 66314 as long as they're objective. But there's also, sometimes folks are proposing like manufactured homes as ADUs. And so it's also important to remember that you have more flexibility under 66323, like if you have a manufactured home, for example, that's not easy to modify to meet those kinds of standards.
I got one here. For AB 1332, if a private party or consultant submits pre-approved template plans that a city approves, are the private party or consultants agreeing to allow anyone to use those template plans, or is it expected for new developers to pay the private party or consultants for those plans? And so the law under AB 1332, 65852.27, specifies that a local agency has to approve or deny those plans, but once approved, they put up the contact information for the consultant or architect or whoever it is for people to reach out to, and then upon submitting or using those plans, have that expedited review period. So they're not agreeing to let everyone have those plans, free and fair, essentially. Those are still their plans.
Cool, let's see.
I got one more here as well.
Sorry.
And it says, could you confirm that attached 66323 units cannot be new construction, but conversion of existing space only? And so under 66323, both single family and multifamily, there is attached or conversion, and there is detached. So A1 and A3 have to do with single family and multifamily conversions, whereas subdivisions A2 and A4 have to do with those detached units. So an attached ADU that is new construction would fall under 66314 and not 66323.
All right. And Michael Viglione asks, since there are no limits on 66323 units other than those in that section, the 66323A4 units, that's multifamily detached, could, for example, be unlimited in size, provided they observe 4-foot side and rear setbacks and applicable height limits. So it is correct that this type of ADU does not have a floor area limit in state ADU law. So it's actually different from the single family detached, which does have a floor area limit. But here there is no specific floor area limit. So it's just kind of like limited by what's practical to build on the property. But the concept of an ADU is that it's relatively small. Yeah. And then let's see. Sue Leffler asked if the local government hasn't implemented any of the safety expectations, I've checked on this, and their ordinance has been okayed by HCD. How can I find out why a discretionary approval process is an allowed requirement in a zone that allows for single family dwelling? So this is something you might want to submit this question to our portal so we can look into it a little bit more. But typically, ADUs have to be reviewed ministerially, and there are just some limited exceptions to that. Like if you're in the coastal zone, there could be a discretionary permit, like a coastal development permit. ADU law does make that, it does defer to the Coastal Act. So I think we'd want to kind of take a closer look and see if we can get more of the context around that question. And then let's see, kind of looking through some of the questions here. Kevin Pez asks, for junior ADU, do we need a kitchen and shower space? So yes, JADUs are defined in such a way that you would need the typical spaces that you would find in a dwelling unit, except that a JDU doesn't have to have its own bathroom. Remember, it can share that with the single family residence as long as there's an interior connection between the two. And then Mary Claire Luna asks, is this available for nonprofits? So state ADU law generally doesn't like restrict who can be the developer of an ADU, but there is one type of ADU that has to be developed by a qualified nonprofit corporation, and that's the ADU that's described in Government Code Section 66341. That's an affordable ADU sold to a qualified buyer at an affordable housing cost. So yeah, nonprofits are definitely welcome in the ADU space, and in that specific situation, it has to be a nonprofit. Thank you for all the great questions. I think we're just kind of trying to look through and we could go all afternoon.
I'm also typing in and answering some of them as well here. Here's one I got. Is AB 1033 separate sale not by right? And the answer to that is correct. A local agency may adopt a program pursuant to AB 1033. They are not required to. There is a very small caveat to the sale of ADUs that applies to a small cutout of like housing organizations or government entities that own the property, but and that is in Government Code 66341, I believe. But that is a very small little caveat to the separate sale issue. And another one here, does a JADU require owner occupancy? And yes, and a JADU requires owner occupancy. That is actually part of the requirements within JADU law, whereas an ADU no longer requires owner occupancy.
And I see Bill Rice asks, how do ADUs work when a community has HOAs? Can an HOA be added when an HOA otherwise might make it not allowed? So yeah, typically, and we kind of discussed this a little bit in the slide about CC&Rs, but typically an HOA would exist when it's a common interest development. And so we do have those civil code sections that talk about CC&Rs that effectively prohibit or unreasonably restrict an ADU are null and void. Sometimes it's a little bit tricky to define exactly where that line is between a reasonable and an unreasonable restriction, but we do have some examples in the handbook. And then I think it's also like it does get a little bit tricky, like if you're proposing changing the common area, but there are some kinds of ADUs certainly that are, especially like the conversion ADUs, where you're really like working inside your unit, where we want to make sure that HOAs are not being unreasonable with their CC&Rs as they're applied to ADUs.
Here's a good one. If we could go back to the slide with the table for single family and multifamily ADUs. There we go. I think that'll probably answer quite a few of the questions that we've got in here. Just looking over that table so that people can see what the allowances are, what the requirements for certain ADU configurations.
Yeah, absolutely. And Trish Turner asks, what about allowing ADUs as Airbnb? So I think that gets at the question of short-term rentals. And so it's a little bit tricky, but basically 66223 units are not permissible as short-term rentals. They can be rented, but they have to be rented on a long-term basis, like 30 days at a time. And then for the units, the ADUs that are subject to the full range of local development standards, those units, the local agency has the option whether or not to prohibit short-term rentals. And then for JADUs, the state law is silent on the issue of short-term rentals, so it does not authorize local agencies to prohibit short-term rentals, but there is an owner occupancy requirement. So if you're renting, unless we're in one of the exceptions to the owner occupancy requirement, if the property owner is renting the JADU, they need to be living. Well, the JADU in general requires the property owner to live in the single family residence, the remainder of the single family residence, or on the JADU. So,
Here's one. Are there any resources for how to create a program for pre-approved plans? On our ADU webpage on the HCD website, there are several links to jurisdictions that have such programs and can walk you through how many of those work. So you'll be able to see those on our ADU webpage. There's, I mean, I think dozens of cities that have shown them to us at this point.
Chris Garcia asks, can a JADU be constructed concurrently with the main single family home on a vacant lot? If so, can a JDU not be a 500 square foot addition to the existing home? If no, then what is the logic to allow new construction, a new JDU, and only allow 150 square foot addition? Okay, yeah, so this is getting at a couple of different things. So first of all, a JDU can be, it has to be within the single family residence, but it can be an existing or a proposed single family residence. So JDU, a JDU wouldn't be through an addition, at least in a single phase, right? Like, so it has to be what you have to be converting something. And then the question also references the 150 square foot addition. So this is something in 66323A1, which is regarding a single family conversion ADU. There's an option to do, it's a conversion, but there's an option to build a 150 square foot addition for ingress and egress. So for example, if you're building like a stairway or a hallway that's needed to provide access to that unit. But the 150 square foot addition applies to ADUs, not JDUs. So it's kind of a fine distinction there. But and the 150 square foot addition has to be on a accessory structure. Marco Flores asked, I'm an architectural designer. Is there anything about JDUs and R2 zones? So the thing that's tricky there is like different local agencies sometimes use different terms to refer to different zoning concepts. So R2, like as a zoning designation, would typically refer to like some kind of a multi-family zone. So the concept for JDUs is like there has to be a single family residence as a primary dwelling, and there has to be a zone that allows single family dwelling. Oh, I think this is an interesting one. Christina Heredia asked, if JDUs are approximately 20% of the housing growth, what municipalities are those going in? I live in a rural area and we only had 3 applications last year. So this is really, I think that question gets at something really interesting, which is like, well, first of all, HCD has, local governments have to do annual progress reports on their general plans. And so HCD has a dashboard that shows like how many units are permitted in each jurisdiction by different unit types, including ADUs. So it's possible to kind of look around there and get a sense of which cities or counties in your area are permitting a lot of ADUs. And then that's an opportunity to reach out to them and learn what they're doing. But because there are hundreds of local governments in California, you know, some local governments may not have received many applications, and so you know, we just want to reiterate, like our team is here to help if ADUs are kind of a newer thing in your jurisdiction. If you have any questions about the development standards, the review process, we're here to help. And then I think the Tyler was discussing the program for pre-approved plans that you know local governments have to have, and I think that's another thing that can be very helpful, especially when like smaller jurisdictions nearby team up to generate some pre-approved plans.
Here's another good one. How does the Permit Streamlining Act apply to ministerial applications? So for ADUs, for example. And so the Permit Streamlining Act will overlap with ADU law, where there is a 30-day period in the Permit Streamlining Act to determine the completeness of an application. and that still applies. So they have 30 days to determine the application's completeness, but they have 60 days from the time that they receive that completed application to give comments. So in the event that they take those full 30 days to determine completeness, that means they only have another 30 days to then issue approval or comments. So essentially, they will run concurrently.
Aaron Casey asks, I have a shed 350 square feet. How big can I go before my property is evaluated for property taxes? So this is the property valuation when you do construction is that's a question that local governments get a lot. Like people might be interested in doing an ADU, but they might be worried about how it affects the property taxes. So on that, it's just you can definitely talk to the county assessor's office and get a sense of that. But that's not like changing the tax basis of the property isn't something that the state does.
Here's another one. Can you talk about the parking requirements for JADUs? Are they exempt? And so JADU law states that no additional parking shall be required for the addition of a JADU. So yes, they are essentially exempt. There can be no additional parking required for a JADU when it is applied for. And that includes cases where the JADU is taking up some of that existing parking. Another one here. Can we build a two-story ADU? So yes, there are certain provisions to that, but ultimately a local agency is required to allow up to 2 stories for an ADU. There are still height requirements and things like that that need to be adhered to, but that can't prevent them from having up to 2 stories in those cases.
Jose Luis Prada asks, with new multifamily developments, is it possible to develop clustered ADUs that are attached to each other, but detached from the main units? And the answer is, generally speaking, yes. So the multifamily, the ADUs that we refer to colloquially as a multifamily detached, which are the 66223A4 units, they have to be detached from the primary dwellings, right? But they don't have to be detached from each other. So it's the concept of detached in ADU detached from the primary dwelling. And let's see, we're yeah, almost at 2:30 here, so maybe we have time for like one more. Look, sorry, there's so many good questions. We're just trying to sort through and think about what we've already answered. I think we can make this the last one. Giselle Linares asks, I've recently been receiving calls regarding the second unit program where 40,000 grant is issued to assist with ADU development. So that sounds like a reference to the Cal HFA ADU grant program. So if you're interested in that program, you might want to get on their email list because they do periodically send out announcements, like if they get a new round of funding for that program. Yeah. And yeah, I think we just wanted to thank all of you for being here, for your interest in ADUs and JADUs. Thanks to everybody who worked on the handbook and helped put this webinar together. Um, and yeah, and again, if you have any, I know there are more questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but the ADU portal is there. We've got a whole team of people who can answer your questions about state ADU law, and we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, so just looking at this, we have almost 550 questions that were asked. We've managed to get to just over 100 of them. So we do apologize. There was a pretty significant attendance here, but we do want to thank you all for joining us. And I do want to reiterate again to point you towards the ADU team portal here for any other questions that you've got. And you can feel free to mention that you were attending this ADU webinar as well. With that, I think I'm going to go ahead and close this out. So again, thank you all for coming.
Thanks so much.